In conversation with Stephen Davenport. Stephen Davenport graduated from Oberlin College in 1953 with a BA in English Literature and then spent 2 years in the U.S. Naval Reserve. From 1955 to 1957, he worked in commercial banking. In 1957, he followed his heart into the education profession, serving as teacher of English, athletic coach, head of school, consultant, and board member of independent school until 2000. Early in his education career, he was a part-time freelance journalist, publishing an article in New York Times Magazine, the Hartford Courant, and the Saturday Review of Literature. He is now a full-time writer. He has been married to Joann Davenport since 1954. They have three children and five grandchildren. And on today's episode of Auto Interview, it's my utmost pleasure and joy to have on the show today, Stephen Davenport. How are you doing, Stephen?
Doing very well, Peter, and it's great to meet you at last, having emailed each other from across the globe to see your handsome
Absolutely.
face.
Yeah, it's lovely to have you on the show today. I'm quite excited to be having a conversation around your literature works.
Well, I appreciate it. I love talking about writing, and every writer
Abs
likes to talk about his own writing, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you. Now, Stephen, could you tell us about your memoir, 90-Day Wonder, how the Navy would have been better off without me? And I want to say that's such an amazing and hilarious title, really, for a book. And now, how does this book come about? What inspired you to write 90-Day Wonder? And what motivates you actually to become a writer at the age of 93?
Well, I'll start with the memoir. The Navy was unlike now in America, where there's no
Mm,
draft. I went to college during the Korean War,
wow.
and many of my classmates or college mates anyway, and teammates.
Yeah.
I played football in college, and I had teammates who were war veterans and had fought through World War II. And being with them, as a young kid, it was like being with a bunch of uncles. And what they had gone through was pretty horrible. And some of them
Mm,
had to go back. They had to go right back when the Korean War started. But I and my teammates were protected from being drafted, which is what happened immediately as you flunk. If you got your grades too low, they flunked you out and you were drafted because our coaches put us into the Naval
mm,
Reserve, which meant we went a junior year, went after a sophomore year. And as soon as we graduated, we were put aboard ships knowing nothing. So it was a
wow.
very, very intense 2 years in my life.
Mm,
And what happened was I sat down one day to write a memoir, and it basically was this big, long thing in which I wrote about everything I could possibly remember. And when it was
wow.
through, and when it was through, I realized, it had no arc. It was just a collection of memories.
Mm,
And I reread the memoir I reread the part that was in the Navy, was about the Navy, and I just pulled it out and published it.
wow.
And I think it's a pretty good book, and it really did talk about one, the privilege, unearned
Mm,
privilege of suddenly being in charge of people who knew more about how to do the stuff that I was telling them to do than I did. All our
wow.
training was on dry land. We knew nothing. And I was bossing people around who were a lot older than I was. And I was frankly incompetent. And I thought it was quite
Wow.
an interesting thing to write about. And so it's mostly a funny book. It's mostly
Mm,
the um, the indignities of being a commissioned officer who had large responsibilities that he had no idea how to handle.
wow.
And it was very different from the experience of the people that I was bossing around,
Mm,
and it was a very striking time. And it was also a time where were the two worlds that you lived in, the world of combat and the world of going to college was so severe. I,
Hmm.
my roommate and I had a very close friend named Dick Kirk, who flunked out of Oberlin and was drafted and went to Korea. And he went as a conscientious objector, but he didn't want to get out of combat. So he
Wow.
went as a medic and he was horribly wounded. And in our senior year, he came back to see us. He was still recuperating. And it was the
Wow.
night before we were to play a great football game that we were very excited about. And he told us the story of his wounding and of the death of the person he was trying to take care of. And the
Wow.
difference between that and the luxurious life of college was just so intense that it was almost beyond emotional comprehension. So
Wow.
that's part of why I wanted to write about that part of my life. It's a very short book.
Wow. Well,
I
that's
made an audio of it too, and because I think memoirs really should be, if you're going to do an audio, it should be in the voice of the writer,
of the writer. Yeah.
and that was fun.
I particularly love it when writers tell their own story in audiobooks. Yeah, because to me, I had a kind of how would I put it? I had a kind of a pull in time past. Well, I was like, I love it when authors narrate their own audiobook rather than having to give it to an audiobook narrator that I kind of say in my own perception make me to get to the information directly from the author and consider the audiobook narrator as a third person narrator. And like, yeah, I'm hearing it from the angle of another person. So yeah, I love it when authors tell their own story. It's quite beautiful. And if you have a copy of your memoir there with you, I'd love you to show it to the camera just so we can see what it
Yes,
looks
I do,
like.
Peter. Can you see
Beautiful
that all
cover,
right?
even. Beautiful.
That's the ship I served on, obviously.
Wow. Wow. That's
And the epilogue in the book is about the I was showing my grandson.
mm,
He was then about 14. He wanted to know about uh, the ship I served on and what that was like. So I went into the internet, and up
wow.
came the video of this ship that we had spent. I'd spent a year and a half on,
Wow.
um, trying very hard, like all of it, not to sink. It was being sunk on purpose to make a
Wow.
reef. It was decommissioned, and they made it into a reef off North Carolina. And you see
Wow.
the ship going down and they and sinking. I was amazed at how moved I was, how I hated watching that ship go down, even though I
Wow.
was very eager to get off it and get through my service. So
Wow.
that's the ending of that book, is that scene, and you can actually see it on the internet if you
Yeah.
look it up.
That's actually amazing to know, really. See, I love the sound of your book and I love your answer to this. And I'm not sure if you've answered my question on what motivated you to become a writer at the age of 93.
Well, I'd always wanted to write. I When I was in the bank after commercial banking, I only
Yeah.
took that job so that I could please my parents and go the traditional, way of that my culture kind of expected. But I spent my evenings and late into the night writing probably the most sophomoric novel that had ever been written by anybody, and I mean sophomore high schoolers. By
Mm,
the time I was through, I'd outgrown the premise, and then suddenly I realized just how desperately I didn't want to be a banker. That's
wow.
just not me. And
Wow.
I love literature. I've been wanting to write all my life, and so a job popped open teaching English in a boarding school, and
Mm,
I took it and discovered that that teaching was probably the only thing that could soothe my desire to write, that could replace it.
Wow.
So it was a job that was just too time consuming and emotion consuming to have much left over to write. I wrote, when I could, and wrote one novel about 6 times that didn't work out, and then
Wow.
always tried to find time to write. And then finally, I quit being a teacher. I'd saved up enough money, and I just started to write, and that's what I do now all day and every day. And it's
Wow.
but at age 93, you mentioned my age. I
Yeah.
should be very grateful. Most of my friends are dead. Most of my young friends are dead. My
Mm.
friends are the people that
Wow.
I taught who are now in their 50s, and we're still very close, and I'm very grateful. But I
Hmm.
have to admit that I'm not a calm man. I started late. I've got 4 books out now.
Wow.
I'm just finishing up one that I've been trying to write for many years. And I'm
Wow.
desperate to get it all done before I'm dead, quite frankly, before the lights go out. And it's the time of your life you should be looking back gratefully, right?
Yeah.
Um, Someday I hope that happens to you, that you have a nice old age and you're
Yeah, I
content
hope
with your
so.
accomplishments. But I have to say, Peter, I'm not. I'm I'm in a hurry because I
Wow.
know, I'm 93, but I have these things I still want to write and rewrite. And it's a it's a it's an interesting,
Yeah.
the contentment you're supposed to have. I keep
Hmm.
trying to develop it, but I'm not succeeding. And I just read the obituary of Alice Munro,
Hmm.
who 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 died at age 92 not long ago.
Hmm.
And she decided, I think 4 or 5 years before her death, that she'd done enough. But then, of course, she accomplished a great deal more than I have. But that's what
Wow.
it's like to be 93 and to be a writer, I think.
Well, I love the fact that you mentioned that you're grateful for being alive, that most of your friends are dead. And that's actually a very great thing to do. And to crown it all, I need to say that you are the oldest author to be featured so far on P English literature, and that's quite commendable. I want to say thank you for for being an amazing, getting to
Well,
the list of our oldest. I've interviewed someone in 83, I've interviewed 85. Well, 93 is the oldest author I've had so far on P English literature in the 4 years of founding it. So that's quite commendable. And thank you for coming, on the show. And it's a pleasure connecting with you, really.
well, thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. I uh, I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you too. That's quite beautiful. And that's quite commendable. I think I have to make an extra post on that, around that. Thank you. Now, for readers who haven't read the book yet, your book, read your memoir, I mean, and without giving much information away, could we have a sneak of what you would expect in terms of themes picking up the book?
One of the things I could expect is that there are scenes of considerable humor, I think. And uh, well, let me just describe the one of
Yeah.
the first scenes. I go aboard the Vermilion, and I know I'm in charge of this part of the ship, the forward part, and on
Yeah.
it are uh, 4 big 50-foot long, 50-ton, what we call mike boats. They're landing crafts. And
Mm,
in them are uh, several smaller boats. And so I show up, and I know nothing about anything. I
mm,
haven't unpacked my suitcase yet. And here comes the chief petty officer in charge of my division. And he tells me, sir, we need to, the ship has a terrible list. We need to move the boats around to make the list go away. Well, he spends the whole morning and going through this incredible operation of moving all the boats around. And when it's all done, there is still a list.
Wow.
The ship is still, and of course, he was just playing with me. It was just a joke. It was just, and that's a pretty funny scene where it goes on and on and on. And I'm just being had by these older people who are just taking me down a long road. And what I had to do, of course, is to pretend it didn't happen, not
Mm.
to get angry, or else my life would have been miserable. And there are other scenes of that nature. My first watch on the bridge,
Yeah.
all my guys put on life jackets and came up and walked across the bridge.
Wow.
And I had to take that as a kind of a joke. But there were other scenes too. There's quite a bit about our wonderful skipper and how he led,
Mm.
how the men loved him because he cared more about them than his own career. How
Mm.
one time we were, it's hard to describe, but how we were ordered to follow in a column to go through a mine-swept channel.
Wow.
How he did not, because the navigator said, no, that's the wrong way to go. And he could have followed and been all right, but he risked his political life in the Navy by uh, doing what his navigator said to show the whole crew that he trusted his navigator. There were things
Mm.
like that. It's hard to describe a book because you write the book in a certain way,
Mm.
but it's a combination of those humiliations and also those learnings about what real leadership was about and about enormous respect for my men who there was the right way and the Navy way, and they all did it the right way. They did it
Mm.
with their own instincts, their own training, their own uh, skills.
Mm.
And they were so far ahead of me in their ability to do their work.
Wow.
That was really the interesting part of it. The what you have to learn from being a privileged person put in a position that has not been earned and that you don't know how to do. It puts you into a
Wow.
situation where you have to carry yourself in a certain way just to get through the day.
Yeah. Wow, that's quite amazing to know, really. That's quite lovely to know. Thank you for sharing. I love the sound of it. And now, Stephen, you also have another book in the name of Saving Miss Oliver's, a novel, Miss Oliver's School for Girls. Would you like to tell us about the making of that as well and what motivated you to write a trilogy of novels set in an all-girls boarding school? Would you love to talk about that?
Yeah, the there's this the saying goes that one writes about what knows. I think normally that's more about what one knows emotionally. But in
Mm.
this case, um, what I realized kind of instinctively that one, if you that a boarding school is an enclosed space. It's a little bit like the novels one reads that take place on a ship.
Yeah.
You can't escape. Everything that happens to humans will happen in a boarding school over the years.
Mm.
All the tragedies, all the joys, all of the little things and big things that occur in a life, and it's compressed. So that was part of it. The other part was that as a school head, I'd learned just how political and how vicious the leadership of a school can be. It's one of the reasons why the second book is called No Ivory Tower.
Mm.
And I had gone through some experiences that just showed me that. And they just resonated with me. They were just still filling me up, wanting to get at them, get the universality of that at them, as opposed to the singularity of what had happened to me in some of my really quite brutal fights,
Mm,
where if you thought you were right, you had to dominate. And so, and also I had taught new school heads. I, I I tried to teach them in summer workshops what it was
mm,
like, and I had found more than once that these new heads were not going to succeed. It was not their fault. They had come naively into a position that was going to destroy them. And so I wrote Saving Miss Oliver's about a naive, quite brilliant, young male head
mm,
who was attracted to Miss Oliver's school because he had lost a daughter in a car accident, he and his wife,
wow,
and he would have chosen that school for him.
wow,
And the reason he was appointed was that the board of trustees had finally gotten up the nerve to fire the charismatic, autocratic head of school that had been there for 35 years, a brilliant
mm,
educator who paid too little attention to the financial side. So they bring
wow,
in this young, wonderful man who was very naive, should not have taken the position. And everybody hates him because he's not Marjorie Boyd, the head that had been dismissed,
wow,
and who had made the school into, it made the faculty into children by making all the decisions. So it's
wow,
basically the story of his first year. Um, and it, I think, universalizes a great many things that I had seen in my career and lived through. And it was just a way of bringing that world to life. And the other part of it was the only kind of school I'd never taught in was an all
yeah,
girls. And so I wanted to
oh,
explore that. I wanted to explore that. And I wanted that extra uh, zest you get out of the feminist passion. It was a
mm,
school designed by a woman, founded by a woman, with a curriculum designed for the way young women learn. And so I respected that. And I just
yeah,
wanted to explore that. The reason he has trouble is the school is under enrolled
mm,
and everybody suspects that he's going to bring boys in, which quite a few single sex girls schools have done in order to build up their enrollment. And one could say they abandoned their mission to do that.
wow,
So it's that kind of world to explore. Um, and I think, and I actually, it was realistic enough so that I use it as a case study in teaching administrators. I
mm,
kind of discovered that novels are, in a way, case studies. When you think
absolutely,
about it,
yeah,
you know, this is what happens in these situations. And the novels that are serious stick to that. They reveal that, the universal experience,
yeah,
the resistance to change. And then you mix into all of that political stuff, the private agonies that are people going
mm,
through,
absolutely,
the marriage that isn't working, the grief
yeah,
over uh, the lost daughter. And
yeah,
it's fun to write. And it wrote itself. It almost wrote
absolutely.
itself.
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning. I love this, and actually, I can actually go on and on and on and on and on. That's quite beautiful. Thank you for your illustration and beautiful description of, Saving Miss Oliver's novel, Miss Oliver's School for Girls. Sounds quite lovely to me. And now, there's this question I love asking authors that come on my show. I know you've written memoir and also you've also written nonfiction. And I've always been fascinated about how writers, especially novelists like yourself, craft long sentences and bring words together in a way that it eventually makes a great novel. And this always leaves me thinking about how exactly they got their ideas and inspirations. Now, as far as writing is concerned, I'd love to ask you, how do you get your inspirations and ideas? Where did they come from?
That's a great question, Peter. You know, it's all about story to me.
Yeah,
Story is how humans make meaning out of life. I think,
absolutely. Wow.
uh, you can explain something in an essay, and that would be very fascinating. But let's just go to the Adam and Eve story. What is that about? It's about the human imagination, right? You tell the story of these two people that were very happy until they got imagination. And then there is no Garden of Eden, right?
Hmm.
Because you
Yeah.
can visualize something that might be better. And so to me, it's all about story. And so when you're thinking about people, you're remembering your own emotions, your high moments, your griefs.
Hmm.
You remember what, well, I'll just tell one story. I remember the first moment I saw my wife. It's just
Hmm.
this image that I'll know that on the day I die. Well, what do you do with that? Do you describe it? No, you say what happens next. Where is that going?
Hmm.
And so to me, it's all about story. And I've always loved to tell stories. The Navy, the stories in this book,
Yeah.
I I used to tell to the kids when I was teaching, and they would wind me up.
Oh.
When they got bored with Hamlet or whatever, they knew just how to turn me on. And I'd tell them these stories, and they really liked them. And I really liked telling them, and they made meaning. I didn't
Hmm.
understand it until I got the story.
Hmm.
Uh, and so I just think I instinctively go to what happens next? Who was that person? Why did they say that? And I think when you're writing, and I'm doing this now, the novel I'm writing now, I don't really know. I mean, I have a vague idea what's going to happen next. Maybe it's not vague, but what happens when I start to write very often is not what I thought it would be,
Hmm.
because I'm in a I'm now not me so much. I'm half me and half the person I'm writing about. And I'm really that person. And that's the fascination. I see the world suddenly partly the way I would see it and partly the way that person sees it. And there's the
Hmm.
discovery, because where's that person in a room someplace? And the sun's
Yeah.
coming in the window. It's real. Maybe there's a fly flying around. It's real.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I can I can see it. And 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 to me, that's the only way to perceive something. I don't really understand something
Wow.
until I see it in the context of that person and the other persons and whatever the struggle is and whatever the conflict is.
Yeah.
I really think that if you take, let's say, history to me, however important it is, and it really is, obviously, it's what happened to happen. Good fiction is what always happens.
Hmm.
It's what happens. It's what's universal. Take the Odyssey. Here's a man that wants to get home. He's desperate to get home. The
Hmm.
120 men, and he has
Hmm.
all these adventures. He spends a whole year with Calypso, a goddess, that you can only imagine.
Mm.
It explains a great deal of human nature. So that's a long answer to the.
Actually intriguing, really. I love your answers. I love your answers to this question. And I can go on and on and on with it. Thank you for mentioning. Sounds quite lovely to me. And now, apart from 90-Day Wonder and Saving Miss Olivers, do you have any other works you've authored or say currently working on?
Yeah, I'm working on a novel that um, I'm calling. I'm either going to call it Old Home Week. I'm going to call it Sacred Places.
Hmm.
I think the background of this story, if I'm not going on too long,
Yeah.
is that I I worked as the director of a summer boarding camp in what could best be described as Robert Frost country, the
Hmm.
rural New Hampshire, all covered by woods, but once not long ago, not very long ago,
Hmm.
was all farmed, and the farming is deserted. Nobody can make a living farming there anymore. And you ramble through the woods, Peter, and you come across cellar holes. You
Hmm.
call barns that don't exist anymore. Uh,
Wow.
you could ramble through those woods and you won't run out of water because you will come across wells that are still there from when people lived there. And so I started writing a novel many years ago about trying to sustain that way of life. What is home? What is
Hmm.
home? And what is this land we live on? And it's the story about two telepathic twins, one of whom has been assigned by his father because he's the youngest to go off and make a living
Yeah.
that would sustain the farm, and the other, the eldest, to stay home, as in the old days where in Jane Austen, right?
Hmm.
That kind of economy, and
Yeah.
and in order to self-determine, they they change. The youngest one stays home, and the oldest one goes off to New York. And it's what goes on in both those places
Yeah.
uh, to to supply the farm with the economic situation it needs to
Hmm.
um, to survive. And it's really about love of land, love of place. Uh, what is home?
Hmm.
How transient we are. When you
Abs-
move, can you make a new home?
Absolutely.
And what are the boundaries of that home? Is it the farm itself, or is it the land around it? Is it the people? And so years ago, I I sent a 49-page story of that to the Atlantic, and they
Wow.
loved it. And but they
Wow.
said it's too long for us. Please write a
Oh.
novel. Well, that was in 1960 something. I mean, I was a young
Wow.
kid, and I
Wow.
wrote it without stopping once I had the flu. And my wife and the kids were visiting her parents, and I was alone home on a
Wow.
long weekend with the flu. And I wrote this thing nonstop. It was just like it just came out of me. But then, they didn't want to publish it. It was too long. It told me to write a novel. And that's been kind of a curse because I've written that novel, I think, 6 times all the way through and never even tried to publish it because it was a mess. But
Uh-huh.
about a year ago, I suddenly discovered to start in the middle. I
Mm.
start in the middle with the death of the mother in childbirth. And I also found the voice. I'd been writing it in distant third person. Now the narrator is one of the two telepathic twins. And
Wow.
it's, I'm writing it like this. It's just coming. And I think that has to do with living with us, I mean, I know these kids a whole lot better than I know my good friends because I'm in their heads.
Mm.
And I've known them since 1970,
Oh, that's a
you
long time
see?
ago.
And because I spent 10 years in that ground
Wow.
and also worked in New York, I know the places. I know where they smell like. I know what they look like. I know what they look like in the morning. It's different when the shadows are different in the evening. And all that is just in your head and in your heart and in your body somewhere.
Mm.
And finally, when you find out the mechanics of the story, where to start in this long time span,
Yeah.
you know, who should tell it? Um, that's the real discovery. Then the writing of it becomes possible.
Mm. That's great.
Well, I mean, you've experienced that yourself, right? What
Yeah.
is the key in? What's the real structure? It's almost as if the novel's already out there and you have to discover it.
Mm.
And again, it's a story. What is the story?
Mm. I love your take on this actually. And I love the fact, I love that you said that story is the way human make a meaning out of life. I have to write that down. I'll ponder on
I
it
think
later on. And it's such a
every
beautiful
Greek myth,
quote.
right?
It's a
The
beautiful
myths in
quote
your
from you.
land, in your culture, they explain, right? Why
Yeah.
we're here, they give meaning to you. Otherwise,
Hmm.
you're just Falstaff, a bag of guts, but you're not. You're a human being. You're
Yeah.
precious in the world,
Yeah.
and and because you're part of a story.
Yeah. I love the definition actually. It sounds very great and weighty. That's beautiful to hear from you. Thank you for mentioning.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you for
Yeah.
letting me talk about it. I really appreciate this, Peter.
Yeah. Thank you.
I almost want to interview you and learn more about you.
That would be fun, really. Thank you. Now, could you tell us what publishing is like for a published author like yourself? Are there any challenges you've encountered in the process of writing your books and ever since it got published? Also, how do you feel having published a memoir and also having narrated it yourself?
That's a good question, and I hope publishing is easier in your country than it is in mine. Again, the only way I can do it is tell a story. When
Hmm.
I wrote Saving Miss Oliver's, really by good fortune through a friend,
Wow.
I found an agent, and he was a wonderful guy. He'd been a newspaper journalist, but he'd gone into agenting because he really loved books.
Oh.
And he was shopping Saving Miss Oliver's around the big guys in New York, you know, Harcourt Brace,
Hmm.
Norton, Simon and Schuster, all those. And not long after he started that, and he'd
Yeah.
gotten a few rejections, but he wasn't ready to quit yet. I stopped hearing from him. And
Oh.
I didn't call because I didn't want to bother him. He's doing his job. I trusted him. Finally, my wife and my son-in-law said, you know, you really got to call him. And I called up and his wife answered. She said, Robert died 2 weeks ago.
Wow. That's too
Cancer.
sad.
And I was heartbroken. I mean, I didn't know him well, but I really liked him. And I had to go through that selfishness. Now, was I more heartbroken because I didn't have an agent anymore? Or
Hmm.
was I heartbroken for this wonderful human being that, died? Being a good person, he as he knew he was dying, he got other agents to take his people, his writers, and
Hmm.
one of them was a guy in New York, and so he was now my agent,
Hmm.
and so I went to see him all the way from California to New York, and he said that he had spent the night before deciding that he wasn't going to shop Saving Miss Oliver's. So I just couldn't go through that. And I'm trying to talk about the publishing industry by telling a story, and interrupt me if that's not the right way to go. But
Mm,
I just could not find another. I didn't have the heart to go look for another agent. So I self-published and it came out
mm,
pretty well. But then years later, a small publisher took Saving Miss Oliver's and its two sequels, No Ivory Tower and The Encampment. And The Encampment was doing pretty well. It was a starred review on Kirkus, and they published it, and I was very satisfied. But all of a sudden, that little company was sold to a big company that I won't name because I don't want to.
yeah.
And they're not doing anything with my books. They're just out there.
Wow.
And so I think the publishing world is it's a difficult world right now.
Mm,
And I don't know what else to say. I mean, I'm not at all happy with the fact that I've got these three books that are just, they don't feel like mine anymore.
oh.
But I think what we have to do as writers is write to write. And you try to get published or you self-publish. I self-published 90 Day Wonder because I thought I would do better with it.
Mm,
And besides, it's a very short book, so I didn't know what the market was for.
yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question, but I do think that there there are now with self-publishing, which is liberating in many ways, it also allows lots of books to get on the market that aren't
Yeah.
readable. Um, and so I think what we have to do is sit down, write the next word, do your best. One of the problems is that you have to spend a great deal of your time, as you know, not writing, but marketing.
Yeah.
And because no one's going to buy a book they don't know exists. It's just
Absolutely.
so I think it's always been this, I suppose. How many very good writers have never made it?
Mm,
As a kid, where I grew up, it just so happened I grew up in a town where the old-fashioned publishers lived. Mr. Harcourt, Mr. Brace,
mm,
both lived and were friends of my parents. They love literature. And
wow.
if they liked your book, they'd publish it. And if they had needed to make the money, they'd publish a cookbook. But they've all been bought up by the big firms. And now I think that the acquiring editor,
Mm.
he doesn't acquire it, he or she, unless the salespeople think it'll work. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. That's amazing, actually. I love your take on that. I so much love your take on that. Thank you for mentioning. Sounds quite great to me. And now, just in case we have some viewers who are currently watching this interview, I would love to get a copy of any of your books. On what platform are they available on for purchase?
Well, they're all on Amazon. They're all at Turner Public. Uh, 90 Day Wonder is on Amazon, and and you can order it through bookstores. It won't be on the shelves in a bookstore.
Mm,
Shelf space is small, and I'm quite frankly a rather unknown writer. Um, but 90 Day Wonder can be bought at a bookstore by ordering it, and I love to support bookstores. We need those places where you can walk in and actually touch
buy
and feel
books.
books and
Yeah,
talk to people who love books.
yeah.
So that's the way I like my books to be sold, but you can get it on Amazon order. And that's true of the school trilogy. You can get them on Amazon and through bookstores and directly from Turner Publishing.
Mm,
Uh, the audio book, you get that on Audible, you get it on Spotify, you can get it on any, that's been well distributed.
mm. That's great. And
And I'm on Facebook and I have a website and all say about how you get my books.
yeah, yeah, thank you. And I left a link in the description part of this interview where interested viewers can get a copy of Stephen Davenport's books directly on Amazon and also on other platform. I also left link to his social media handles for possible followings. So thank you so much, Stephen, for accepting the invitation to be featured on P English Literature. It's awesome having this conversation with you.
Well, I've loved it and I really appreciate it. I'm inspired.
Thank you.